I want to talk a bit about myself. At the early stages of my career, I mean, I've worked in HR for the majority of my career, but at the early stages, I just found that I had this passion for employment law. So I decided to take a career break and I trained to become a lawyer. And following law school, I was at a crossroads. I didn't know whether to continue with my on-the-job training to become an employment solicitor or whether to sort of go back into HR because, you know, I'd gained qualifications and transferable skills. So I eventually made that decision to go back into HR. And I worked for two large HR consultancies for about 10 years. But it was during the pandemic when I literally had two phones to my ears, trying to support small to medium businesses, talking them through the whole furlough scheme. And it was really intense. I mean, it was good in one sense because people finally understood the value of HR and what it could bring to the business. And people were talking about HR issues that I've been dealing with for many years, things like layoffs and redundancies, flexible working, you know, working from home, mental health came higher up on the agenda, and employee well-being and engagement as well. So during the time of the pandemic, I'd worked for this large HR consultancy, and we provided a 24/7 advice line. And honestly, it felt like I was working 24/7, giving advice to SME businesses. And I think, like other HR consultants during that time, it was very intense. And I was suffering from burnout. I still had that passion for HR, but I wanted to do it on my own terms. So I decided to start my own business. So in March 2021, during the lockdown period, I founded a Face2Face HR Streatham Hill. And this is part of a franchise. And the reason why I decided to join the franchise Face2Face HR is because of the ethos. It was very much about providing a personalized, bespoke service to SME businesses rather than an anonymous 24/7 advice line. So that's just a bit about myself. I should have said that at any point during this talk, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to. So first of all, I want to do this employment law quiz, which is going to test your knowledge because there are a lot of myths about employment law. So what I'm going to do is just give you these questions and give you an opportunity to think about it. And then I'm just going to give you the answers. So firstly, number one, you can't give a bad reference. Is that true or is that false? Number two, does no written contract mean there's no contract between the employer and employee? Is that true or is that false? Number three, if you catch someone doing something serious red-handed, you can sack them on the spot. Is that true or is that false? Well, I'm not sure how well-versed you are with employment law, but I thought I would just go through each of these questions and give you the answer and maybe sort of dispel some myths. So number one, you can't give a bad reference. That is actually false. And that's it's a myth that I widely hear being spoken about, or you can't give a bad reference. That's not actually right. And you can give a bad reference. It's as long as it's factual and it's objective. For example, if somebody has been off sick, you can put on a reference that X, you know, so-and-so had X days off sick. Or if you did, say, dismissed for gross misconduct, you can then state that in the reference. And I actually had a client call me up just yesterday from a care home. And she got a reference request from one of her ex-employees. And she said to me that there was a question on the reference request that says, would you rehire this person? And she said, well, strictly speaking, no. And I said to her, but can you back that up? If you can't really, then it's subjective and I would avoid answering that question. So what I said to her is that references, they are exempt from being viewed by the ex-employee. They're covered by an exemption on GDPR. But that doesn't mean that the new employer might not just show it to the employee anyway. So you've got to be careful about what you write in a reference, because you can be sued in negligence for that. So number two, does no written contract mean there is no contract between employer and employee? Is that true or false? That is false. There is a verbal contract there, and it will be based on statutory terms. And so the thing is, it's much better to have a written contract of employment to avoid any disputes. And people underestimate the value of a written contract of employment in terms of it being a management tool as well. So I would definitely say that it's worth getting a written contract of employment or a statement of particulars in place. Number three, if you catch someone doing something serious red-handed, you can sack them on the spot. True or false? I would say that that's false. Coming from an HR point of view, I would always say that you should conduct a fair and thorough investigation before you move to dismissal. What you observe as something sackable offence may not always look like what it is. For example, if you saw somebody putting their hand in the till and taking some money out, you don't really know the circumstances regarding that. It might be they may have purchased something themselves through their own money, and then they're just taking it out of the till to rebalance. Or even if there's like a fight or a physical altercation, you don't know if there was some form of provocation and who traded the first blow. So that's why I would advise not sacking somebody on the spot. So moving on, when does an SME business need HR help? And it was something that Gareth raised, and it's really important. There are two schools of thought here. The first one is you don't need HR at the startup stage. At the startup stage, you're risk-taking, you're wearing different hats, there's less structure, hiring's done informally, and the organizational culture is really based around the founders. I know what that feels like because I'm at the startup stage myself. But I'm with the second school of thought, where I believe that you need HR when you are a startup, and definitely when you're at that growth stage. Usually that means around 10 employees or more. And I'll give you an example of why I think a startup needs HR advice. With contracts, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you do have to give a contract of employment by the first day of employment when the person first joins. It used to be the case that you'd have 8 weeks in which you can issue a contract, but that's no longer the case. It's changed since April 2020. So I would say a startup should get HR advice, even at the startup stage, to draft your contracts for your casual workers or employees, because I think it's likely to trip you up in the future and could end up with a costly claim. I recently did a post on LinkedIn, and thank you for all the people who contributed and left comments on that post. It was about using ChatGPT to draft contracts. And I talked about the risk of doing that because there's no guarantee that it's correct. And my understanding is the free ChatGPT version is only correct as of 2021. So there are things like statutory increases, such as the increase in national minimum wage, that takes place on an annual basis. And ChatGPT doesn't really recognize that. So you could end up putting your employees on the wrong national minimum wage. And if you do that across the board, it could end up as being a very costly unlawful deduction of wages claim, and it could be linked to discrimination claims as well. And at the startup stage, that's that could be something that could lead to the closure of the business. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. And also, I did another post on LinkedIn about I don't know if you've seen in the news that M&S and Argos were all named and shamed for not paying their employees the national minimum wage. So for big name companies for that, like that, they can get it wrong, but they can suck up the reputational damage. But that's a bit harder for a startup. The next example, I would say why it's important for a startup to get HR support is when a startup is looking for investment at the growth stage. When a startup is pitching for investment, it's a mistake not to demonstrate the value that of the company that it has through its people. And you should try to identify who will be responsible for the growth and the traction to make you more investable. And it is worthwhile to tell your investors that your team has the ability, the experience, and the commitment in order to provide them an ROI. And informing investors that you have HR advisors or expertise in place could make your pitch that much stronger. So what problems do startups and small business owners face? Well, I would say that one of the biggest issues that I find is when startups don't have any contracts in place. And I explained with the employment law quiz the difficulties that they can bring, or their contracts are out of date. For instance, I tend to find that a lot of startups don't know that they have to automatically enroll their employees into a pension. And if they don't, you can get fined by the pension regulator. So it's these little things that can catch a startup or an SME business out. And employment law is constantly changing, either through case law, through the employment tribunals, or through the courts, or it's employment legislation. For example, there's a raft of new legislation that's been brought in 2024. I'm not sure if anybody's aware of this. Lots of family-friendly legislation that's coming into force. For example, there is some legislation about supporting parents who give birth to babies who need neonatal care. There is extension for protection from redundancy for new parents, and that extension of protection is going to continue when they return to work. And there is also unpaid carers leave that's coming into force as well. And another interesting piece of legislation that is due to come into force in 2024 is that employers will now have the duty to protect their employees from third-party harassment. And that's harassment from customers or clients. And there's already been feedback from businesses in the hospitality sector who are saying, they're feeling like they're going to have to police people's conversation, with their staff. Say you run a pub and then there's that banter that there is between your employees and the customers, and you're just going to have to be constantly aware of when that's crossed the line and the steps you need to take in order to protect your employees. So that's going to be an interesting piece of legislation that's coming in 2024. And I'm not sure if any of you are aware of this. So I think there is the need for HR expertise at the startup or small business phase, but often, it's not affordable to have a full-time or a part-time resource. So I think it's important to understand the cost of getting things wrong. I already mentioned putting a staff on the wrong national minimum wage rate can lead to unlawful deduction of wages claims. And if your employees have 2 years service or more, they can lodge an unfair dismissal claim. And that's over 100K, or the maximum is 1 year's pay. And with discrimination, you don't need any service whatsoever. You can receive a discrimination claim even at the stage of interview. And the amount that they can be awarded is unlimited. And so that's a big risk to take. And the cost is greater on a startup. And like I said, it could lead to the closure of the business. So, you know, you've got to ask yourself, is it worth not getting that HR advice? So I just want to spend some time talking about how I can help SME businesses. Now, it's so interesting. We had this discussion earlier about free services offered, because I do offer a free 30-minute HR checkup service, which enables me to audit uh, small businesses and startups, their documents, their systems and processes. I don't charge for that service, but what I do is provide them with a report which outlines the legal risks and you know, where their business is at risk through their documentation and their systems. And then I do say at the end of the report how I can remedy the situation and then include the costs. And I have a fairly, I don't know, about a 60% conversion rate for these HR checkups. So I don't know how good you consider that. I also provide recruitment services, placing adverts, sifting, drafting job descriptions, sitting on interview panels. And I think people underestimate how important and how time and labor intensive recruitment can be, particularly for a startup. So it's useful to have that professional advice on hand. I draft contracts and employee handbooks. And I conduct disciplinary processes. For example, if somebody is late or they haven't come in at all, if they're AWOL or if they're off sick. In terms of grievances, if any complaints arise from their employees about another employee or even about management, then I can come in and hear it as an independent person. And I find that being an external HR consultant, I can take the heat out of certain situations. So I definitely feel that that's a benefit. And of course, I ensure that the fair legal process has been followed. So in terms of performance, if somebody is not performing up to scratch, I can help with performance management. And sometimes that involves exiting somebody from the organization. I've been doing lots of reorganizations and redundancy processes, and that was really as a consequence of the pandemic and due to the cost of living crisis. And there have been particular issues with the hospitality sector. I can help with change management processes such as 2P, the transfer of undertaking protection of employment. I'm not sure if anybody knows about that legislation, but that's when a business takes over another business, another company, or a contract. And more, I'm being asked to deal with issues related to employee well-being. I think as a consequence of the pandemic, it's something that businesses are a lot more aware of. And I offer packages. There's the first employee package, which gives SME businesses and startups that support when they want to take on that first employee and they don't really know where to start. I provide a contract, I provide discipline and grievance policies and an employee privacy notice and a guide that they can follow as well. And also I provide a retainer package, which is more of a more long-term relationship. Usually my retainer only lasts for a year and most clients decide to renew after a year. So that's how I can help SME businesses and startups. So now the different ways, I can be very flexible in the way that I help SMEs, being an outsourced HR consultant. You can use me as little or as much as you want. For example, you could use me on an ad hoc basis in which, you know, you pay me the fees and hourly rate, or a project work, like I said, you know, a disciplinary or grievance or redundancy, and I can provide a project fee. Or if you want a longer term relationship with me, I can provide a retainer service, which is offering unlimited advice by email or by phone. I have quarterly review meetings in which I go out to see my clients. I draft their documentation and ensure that it's in line with current legislation. And I have an HR information system called Breathe HR, which is helping small businesses move from being paper-based to cloud-based software. And to sort of show you how this works in practice, I worked with a startup. He created an app which provides agency workers and self-employed contractors for the construction industry. So with this startup, he came to me wanting to know what the employment status is of the people who he's going to send to the end client. And I did an employment status assessment to determine whether they were employees or not, and who had responsibility for them. So I looked at the terms of business that had been drawn up by the solicitor, and I came to the conclusion that they weren't really employees. They were casual workers, they were agency workers, and I drafted an agency worker agreement for him. And also he took on independent contractors, and I drafted a contract for services. That's documentation that you use for independent contractors. So from that ad hoc advice that I'd given him, he was able to set up his business knowing that all his documentation was legally compliant. And this particular individual, he is doing really, really well. He's on an accelerator program. And I'm really happy that I was able to support him in starting, helping to start his business. So I thought it would be useful also to give you some case studies of how I've worked with SMEs at particular stages. I'm dealing with one SME, which is at the growth stage. It's a construction-related business. And actually, Gareth is a non-exec director with this particular business. So I have been working with Gareth. And I've come into the business and I've helped them move. It's a family-run business, but make things more professional and make things more consistent through drafting their contracts and employee handbook. I've implemented an HR information system for them, which enables them to do timesheets remotely. I had to unfortunately dismiss an apprentice who he didn't have, he wasn't adhering to health and safety. So we had to move him along. And I also am part of helping them to build a sales team. It's so that the business owner who has responsibility for the sales activity can be more hands-off. So I'm helping with the recruitment to build a sales team as well. And they haven't really got a performance review process in place. So I have brought in a performance management process, and that will help with succession planning as well, and identifying training needs. And because there have been a few issues with employees in terms of their mental health, I have been looking into bringing an employee assistance program, which is particularly important for the construction industry, because it's got a reputation of, and statistics have backed this up, that they have the highest rate of male suicide. So I really feel that it's important that we put in employee well-being for them as well. A lot of the time, people in the construction industry, it can be quite lonely because you work away on site, away from family and friends. So that's something that I've brought in for that particular business. And the next case study I'm going to speak about is the private equity investor that I'm working with. He's taken over 4 companies, and they include 2 manufacturing and 2 professional services companies. He's acquired those 4 businesses because they weren't particularly doing well and they were at the point of insolvency. So I am the HR consultant for 2 of their businesses, and I'm hoping to help with the 2 others. So what I've been dealing in the first instance with is managing out employees who have conduct or performance issues. And that's probably why the business wasn't doing as well as it could have been. So why I'm involved is moving out some senior people, by the way. I'm moving those people on, and then I'm helping to recruit and replace these people. And having the right people in place is so important on a small business. So we're going through the recruitment process at the moment. I'm also drafting their contracts and employee handbooks, which sets out their mission and their values, and so that there's more consistency in the way that issues are dealt with and standards of performance. I'm rolling out some training on bullying and harassment, because in one particular business, there was the way that people interacted with one another was inappropriate. And so there needs to be training around how they interact with one another. I'm also doing some training on performance reviews, and I'm implementing a new performance review process. And this will have the knock-on effect on improving the company performance overall. So lastly, I'm going to talk about retention being the new recruitment. I'm not sure if anybody has heard that term before, but I think because there is a recruitment shortage in the UK, I think it's more important than ever that you retain good quality staff. I on average, I understand that the cost of recruitment is on average about £30,000. That's when you talk about the fees for placing adverts and the management time that's involved in the whole recruitment process. And the employee value proposition is about why employees want to choose to work for your business as opposed to another. So that is talking about your culture. It's about your career development, your mission, your values, the work-life balance, policies that you have in place, such as sustainability and ESG, diversity and inclusion. And although I try to not make some generalizations about, Generation Z and X, but it's, there is a view that Gen Z employees are much more in tune with these kind of policies and values of the organization. So that's something to bear in mind. And also the benefits are important, and just ensuring that you remain competitive. But it shouldn't be overestimated how important the salary is, because I recently read in a survey that people value a good working environment, and it's more important than even a 10% salary increase. So the way that you would keep track of your employee value proposition is to conduct surveys. I would suggest that it's important to conduct surveys every quarter if you possibly can, just to ensure that you remain competitive, and also follow up with individuals on a one-to-one basis at during your one-to-ones and performance reviews, to see what is the motivator for that particular individual to stay at the company. So this is I would say that my ideal client are small to medium businesses, 1 to 50 staff. I concentrate on the hospitality, construction, and professional services industries, but because of my background of working in HR consultancies, the large ones, I can really help any business. And I don't know if you could tell, but I'm from South London, but I can cover the whole country via Zoom. So I'm able to operate in across the UK. So to conclude, I would say that there are different schools of thought as to when HR can add value to a business. From my personal point of view, I feel that it's advisable for startups and SMEs to have some sort of HR support from the outset, definitely to draft contracts, as I've demonstrated earlier. But I also think that the importance of having HR at the growth stage to take the businesses to the next level. And without that HR support, there really is a risk to startups and SME businesses, and because you can see how much it costs through getting it wrong. And for a startup or a small businesses, that could lead to the closure of the business and real reputational damage. And so once you get that HR support, it's beneficial for SME businesses to retain quality staff, to enable startups and SMEs to sustain their growth. So I think the time is now for questions. So I am going to shut down this presentation and take some questions now.
Edua, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. There's something I want to share.
Yeah.
I think when you hit that sort of 5 or 10 employee, to bring in a really good support service on HR is essential. I did it, and I think you and I were having a conversation recently, weren't we, about even if you employed someone direct to look after HR as a SME, it's impossible almost to keep up with all of the legislation, the compliance and everything else. And obviously putting it in the hands of someone like you, it's like an extra insurance policy, and I think it's very, very important that, and sometimes I've seen businesses really wrap themselves up and twist themselves up with HR when they should be focusing on, you know, developing and growing the business as well. So there's a lot to that. Brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Any questions for Edua while we got her on this morning with us?
Please feel free to fire away.
Yeah. Tom.
Sorry, I've talked way too much today, but I do have a quick question.
Yes.
Edua, you mentioned employer value proposition. This interests me a lot.
Yes.
And I've noticed some of my work getting sort of people trying to sort of drag me into this space. My question is this: what in your view should people really be doing with as an employer value proposition? What's it, because there's so much lip service and so much that just actually feels completely disingenuous about this stuff. So what do you think? What do you think actually are the core things that really should be talked about in an employer value proposition?
Yeah, it's certainly something that has been talked about a lot in HR circles, a lot more these days. And I think that came about as as a consequence of the pandemic. You know, so many things, and from an HR point of view, have come. I mean, some positive things have come out of a difficult situation. And I would say that the employee value proposition, it varies according to sector. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I would say, you know, like I mentioned before, it's things like culture. What sort of culture do you have within your organization? It's things like, the policies. And I know what you mean about lip service. You know, do you have sustainable policies or not? You know, do you really have diversity and inclusion within your business? What are you really doing about it? So I get what you mean, and these are tending to be buzzwords, and it's important that employers follow through with that sort of thing. And I mentioned, like, not trying to make generalizations about Gen Z, but they really, younger people really are thinking about what are the values of the organization, and they will challenge, employers on that. And I recently spoke to a contact whose daughter was in a very high paid job, and she left it. I mean, she was really doing well. She was earning lots of money, and she left it because the values of the company were not aligned with her own personal values. So I think employee value proposition, it's a combination of things. It's not one size fits all. And when I spoke about, undertaking surveys, it's really important that you understand not only what's important to within your sector, but what's important to your employees within your own organization. And you'll only know that if you actually speak to them and get feedback. A lot of the times these things, employee value proposition, it's a very top-down sort of thing, hey, we're doing this on diversity inclusion, we're doing this and that. And really, you have to look at, is this something that your particular employees are going to value? And then follow through on that.
Yeah, I think that's great. As I say, it's hard because I'm getting dragged a little bit towards doing that sort of work at the moment. But I'm finding it really hard because people don't. it's almost like it's caught up at a kind of director level, where
Yes.
directors are going, well, our employer value proposition should be like people like me with my aspiration for the business. Like, the people who work for you may not give a monkeys about where you're trying to take your business.
Yeah.
They're just a job. It's just a job to them. They don't care about the growth of your business. They don't care where you're going. And that's not what your employer value proposition is. It's like, if you come work here, what is the proposition to you? And I'm struggling like mad to just even get founders and directors to even see it through that lens.
But it's so important, especially with the recruitment shortage. You know, I think you have to think about your employee value proposition when you are going out to recruitment. Even from your ads, you have to talk about what it is that, you know, is going to attract people to want them to come to your workplace. And then, like I said, you've got to follow through with that. That follows through in the onboarding, in the policies and procedures. That it's so important that it's not just buzzwords being talked about at a very strategic level. So that's why I talked about having surveys, but not, you know, I was an employee as well. And, you know, some people, sometimes you get survey fatigue as well. And, you know, you're always being asked your opinion. And what leads to survey fatigue is that if you don't have the action points and you follow through. And also, that's why I said it's really important to have these discussions during one-to-ones, and especially during your performance review, because, you know, the great resignation and quiet quitting, they're buzzwords. They're still things that will really exist, you know. And so you've got to be on top of these things. So I definitely feel that your employee value proposition, it starts from when you're recruiting people, but it's a continuous process that you've got to be thinking about and looking at.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Neil.
Yeah, thank you. A fantastic presentation, and
Thank you.
yeah, just really interested to know your thoughts on understanding how these cultures are changing, because I know businesses are struggling with keeping up, you know, with people wanting to put their lives before, you know, the honor of having a job. And something I like to talk about is similar to Tom. I'm getting, you know, company values, which always seem to be customer out, are becoming ever increasingly important for employees. And I almost like to change the language in the fact that employees are customers of a business.
Yeah.
You know, they are part of that journey. And I mean, are you finding any business owners who you think about, well, how does my business fit into the story of my employee's life? You know, because it's always quite transactional in the sense that customers give us money, so we care about them. Employees, we pay them, and they should be grateful for having a job. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's it. I'm rambling, so please answer my question.
No. I think this is a really great conversation that we're having here, and it links back to the employee value proposition as well, and understanding your employees are internal customers. You know, you've got to keep them happy in order for them to be productive, in order for them to want to continue working with you. I think it's this shift that's happened, that's taken place due to the recruitment shortage, and it's forcing employers to think a lot more about how are they going to keep their employees happy, as opposed to, you know, back in the day, you're paid a salary. If you don't like it, there's the door, and we'll get somebody else in. It's not that easy to do that anymore. And as I mentioned, it's very costly to replace key talent within the business. So especially what I found really interesting is when I've been speaking to people doing, you know, people who do branding, and that's, you know, that's their main business. And I say, do you speak to your employees as part of the branding process? Because to me, it's got to follow through to the employee. Otherwise, there's this dissonance. There's a lack of consistency. And I think we've all been there. You know, I've been employed, and I know that companies have gone out there and say, we do this and we're this, that, and the other. And employees are really saying, really? You know, and you've got to think about the culture that you're trying to create. You create that culture through individual actions. So you need to get employees on board with that. it's not just paying lip service anymore. So really with the branding process, I've enjoyed having some really great conversations with people about ensuring that they speak to employees as part of that, you know, rebranding or branding process that's taking place. I don't know if that helps.
No, it does indeed. No, and I see I put your hand up, Gideon, so I'll be quick. It's something that I saw, especially in my consulting times, where businesses were understanding to actually move things forward, they had to actually include the experience of employees to make it work, because that has two benefits. One, you get the experience of all the people in the room, but also to move a business forward, your brand has to live with your employees, and if they feel a sense of ownership, they're much more likely to want to make it happen. And trying to build that sense of ownership is a continual conversation. So, you know, I don't believe in silo branding departments and marketing departments, everything. I think everybody should be together and part of that overall process. But anyway,
I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Gideon.
Hi, Gideon.
Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. Hello.
Thanks for sticking around.
I just wanted to reinforce that point with a kind of, it's okay. I wanted to reinforce the point you just made about branding and employees with a live example. I'm actually this week, yesterday and the rest of this week, I'm doing some testing out some branding for a client, and this is like the end of the process, and it's almost like a bit of a throwaway. Oh, let's do some employee sessions and see what they think, and it's almost like, oh, it's a bit of box ticking, and 2 sessions in, we've got 2 more this week. It's fundamentally ripped up, you know, put some real boots into what's been developed, and you know, I wish we'd started with the employees, with the staff. Fantastic. Because there's so much insight there, you know, and that could have been, you know, and the process is going to go a bit wonky from now on, but thank goodness that we've done this, because I definitely advise anyone to be doing that kind of testing with employees, but maybe start with employees even before you go out to customers.
That's really interesting to do that earlier on in the process.
Well, I think there's so much understanding. I mean, this is a particular client. They're a charity. They're a niche charity, so it might not be the case for everybody. But they have so much kind of experience of working, you know, in what works, what might not work with, you know, and they have to, you know, they have to go out and sort of sell that organisation, right? They have to feel proud to work there. So it's definitely. They're a very a key stakeholder, and not a box ticking stakeholder, I'd say.
I like that, a key stakeholder. Definitely. Thank you so much.
Well,